The return to the cabin, the sky, above the Blue Ridge Mountains, was a bruised shade of violet, with the last rays of daylight bleeding into the horizon when I finally turned off the highway and onto the narrow dirt road that led to my cabin. The world beyond those mountains had been chaos: meetings, politics, deployments, and the never-ending demands of responsibility. But here, on this isolated stretch of woodland, life always slowed down. The crunch of gravel under my tires sounded like a hymn, reminding me that this place wasn't just a cabin built out of wood and nails. It was the soul of my sanctuary, a retreat carved by my own hands after years of service where silence meant freedom and the scent of pine was sweeter than perfume. I hadn't set foot on this land in nearly 6 months, maybe longer, and as I drove deeper into the thick tree line, I felt that familiar hum in my chest, the one that whispered, "You're home now." The cabin came into view slowly, its shadowed frame standing tall against the backdrop of evergreens. The roof glistened faintly, damp with the residue of afternoon rain, while the porch swing I'd built years ago creaked softly in the evening breeze, swaying as if welcoming me back. I parked the truck a few feet from the front steps and killed the engine, letting the silence of the forest rush in. For a long moment, I just sat there gripping the wheel, staring at the cabin, breathing in the quiet. Every soldier knows what it's like to crave stillness, to want nothing more than to lay down your burdens where no one can reach you. That's what this cabin meant to me. But the peace didn't last long. Even before I stepped out of the truck, I noticed small details that were wrong. The mailbox by the road was dented, as if struck by something heavy. The grass, which I always kept trimmed before leaving, was not only overgrown but uneven, like someone had half-heartedly attempted to mow it and gave up halfway through. My gut twisted with suspicion. Out here, nobody touched my land. Everyone knew it belonged to me. At least, that's how it used to be. I walked up the porch, the wood creaking under my boots, and fished the keys out of my pocket. The lock was intact, but when I turned the key, the door stuck for a moment, as though it had been opened and shut too many times while I was gone. A wave of unease rippled through me, but I shook it off, pushing the door open. The interior smelled faintly of pine and dust, but also of something else, something sour and unfamiliar. The fireplace was clean, swept of ashes I knew I hadn't bothered to clear the last time I was here. A blanket that belonged in the upstairs chest was draped sloppily over the couch, and a mug sat abandoned on the kitchen counter, still bearing the faint brown stain of coffee long evaporated. That's when it hit me. Someone had been here. I stood in the middle of the living room, every sense sharpening. Years of training made me calm, analytical, scanning for clues rather than panicking. Whoever had squatted here didn't care much for covering their tracks. The coffee mug wasn't mine. The blanket was out of place. And worse, one of my old service caps was missing from the rack near the door. I clenched my jaw, a low burn starting in my chest. But the strangest thing of all wasn't the evidence of intrusion, it was the audacity. Because if there was one thing everyone in this valley knew, it was that this cabin wasn't just some vacation rental or forgotten shack in the woods. It was mine. As I stepped back outside to check the perimeter, the sound of a voice pierced the stillness. "Well, well, I knew it. I knew you'd try this stunt." I froze, turning slowly toward the direction of the voice. There she was, Karen. Or, as the neighborhood had come to know her, HOA Karen. Mid-50s, blonde hair sprayed into a stiff helmet that defied the mountain humidity, arms crossed like a self-appointed sheriff of the forest. She was standing at the edge of my driveway, her lips curled in a smug little smirk, like she'd just caught a burglar red-handed. "Excuse me," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. "Don't play dumb," she snapped, marching a few steps closer. "This cabin belongs to the homeowners association now. You can't just waltz in here like you own the place." My laugh was short, incredulous, and edged with steel. "That's because I do own the place." Karen scoffed, pulling a folder of papers from her tote bag and flipping them theatrically. According to the HOA's updated bylaws, properties left unattended for more than 90 days are considered abandoned and subject to reassignment. She waved the papers in my face like they were holy scripture. "Which means this land is under HOA jurisdiction now, and you, sir, are trespassing." I stared at her for a long moment, letting the absurdity of her words settle. My cabin, my cabin that I built with my own hands, funded with blood, sweat, and years of service, abandoned? Jurisdiction? By an HOA that wasn't even formed until after I bought this property? You've got to be kidding me, I muttered. But Karen wasn't joking. Her eyes glittered with malicious delight, feeding off the confrontation. If you don't leave this property immediately, I'll have no choice but to report you to the county deputies. My fists curled at my sides, not out of fear, but out of restraint. I'd dealt with worse threats than an HOA bully with a clipboard. Still, there was something about her confidence, the way she practically salivated at the idea of calling the cops, that told me this was just the beginning of a much bigger storm. I took a slow step toward her, my voice low but firm. You go ahead and make that call, Karen. Let's see how it plays out. Her smile widened, triumphant, as she pulled her phone from her pocket. Oh, I will, she said, punching in a number with relish. And as she pressed the phone to her ear, glaring at me like she'd already won, I couldn't help but think she has no idea who she's messing with. Section 2. Karen appears Karen didn't leave after the call. If anything, she dug her heels in like a general waiting for reinforcements, pacing near the edge of my driveway with her phone clutched tightly in one hand, and that smug expression frozen on her face, as if she'd already claimed victory in a battle that hadn't even begun. And as I stood there watching her, the absurdity of the entire situation pressed down on me, because in all my years of service, through deployments, negotiations, even heated standoffs with men who carried real weapons, I had never encountered an opponent quite like this, someone so convinced of their imaginary authority that they wielded a clipboard and a cell phone with the same arrogance as if they were military-grade weapons, and what made it worse was the history. I knew Karen's type long before this moment, the self-appointed rule enforcer who thrived not on law or justice, but on control, the kind of person who saw community guidelines as a throne. To sit on rather than a framework to keep neighbors civil, and as she stalked around my property like she was staking a claim, I remembered the stories I'd heard in passing about her antics. The fines she tried to impose for someone's grass being 2 inches too long, the warning letters she left for families who dared to hang wind chimes that, in her words, disrupted the neighborhood's auditory harmony. The threats she made when a teenager parked his truck on the street instead of in his driveway, and I realized with a tightening in my chest that she must have been circling my cabin like a vulture the entire time I was away, waiting for the chance to swoop in and twist the absence into abandonment, her greed and thirst for dominance disguised as civic duty. And now she was standing here, relishing the moment she thought she'd caught me red-handed in what she considered a crime, when in reality she was trespassing on my patience more than I was ever trespassing on my own land. And as she ended the call with the deputies, she announced it loud enough for me to hear they're on their way, and when they get here, you'll regret trying to play games with the HOA, her tone dripping with condescension, her voice carrying across the clearing like the screech of a hawk, and I felt the old soldier in me stir, the part of me that never reacted with anger or fear, only with calculation, that measured every word and every movement like pieces on a battlefield map, and I knew that if she thought this was a fight she could win by sheer noise, she had another thing coming. So I leaned casually against the porch post, crossing my arms, deliberately calm in the face of her theatrics, and said, "You really think a couple of deputies are going to side with you over the man who holds the deed to this land?" Which only seemed to fuel her, because her face flushed red, her lips pinched into a thin, tight line, and she fired back. "The HOA is the law here, and once they see you're nothing but a squatter, they'll escort you off this property faster than you can say trespass," a statement so laughable and legally inaccurate that I almost felt sorry for her ignorance. But her tone made it clear that this wasn't about the law at all. It was about ego, about the thrill she got from flexing her imagined authority. And as she strutted toward the porch with her papers still clutched in hand, waving them like a royal decree, I caught a glimpse of the ridiculous boldness that drove her, because she didn't just stop at the edge of the driveway. She walked right up to the bottom of my steps as though daring me to push back, as though convinced that this was her stage and I was the intruder, and the sheer audacity of it struck me in a way that almost made me laugh out loud. But instead I let her rant, let her parade her so-called bylaws, let her relish the sound of her own voice as she declared that my cabin was now subject to community redistribution, and that I should cooperate peacefully to avoid escalation. Because every soldier knows that sometimes the best strategy isn't to engage immediately, but to let the opponent burn through their energy, to let them overplay their hand until the weight of their arrogance crushes them under their own contradictions. And so I stood there silent, watching her dig deeper into her fantasy, waiting for the sound of distant sirens or the crunch of tires on gravel that would signal the arrival of the deputies, and in that waiting, I felt something unexpected, not dread, not anxiety, but a faint thread of amusement, because if Karen thought she was about to humiliate me, she hadn't considered for a second what would happen when the deputies arrived and realized who exactly she had called them on, and that irony, that impending collision of her delusion with reality, made the stillness of the forest hum with anticipation, like the pause before a storm, and deep down I knew this was just the opening act of a much larger play that Karen had no idea she was starring in. Section 3. The confrontation the minutes that followed felt stretched thin, each second bending under the weight of tension as Karen refused to stand still, pacing my driveway like a guard dog whose bark was louder than its bite, muttering to herself about bylaws and community standards, pulling out her phone again and again, not just to check on the deputy's arrival but to fire off rapid messages, no doubt rallying her little flock of HOA disciples, and sure enough, it wasn't long before the first of them appeared, an older man with suspenders and a permanent scowl, marching down the gravel path with a flashlight in hand even though the sun hadn't fully set yet, announcing himself as though he were some kind of backup officer. And then came another, a woman dragging her poodle on a leash while glaring at me like I'd personally offended her by daring to exist in my own cabin, and within 15 minutes, 3 more gathered, standing awkwardly behind Karen like villagers at a witch trial, whispering, pointing, letting her lead the charge because she'd convinced them that the monster they needed to fear was me, the man who built the very foundation they were standing on. And I couldn't help but marvel at the absurdity of it all, because in their eyes I wasn't a homeowner or a veteran or a neighbor. I was a trespasser, a squatter, a problem that needed to be removed, and the sheer injustice of it threatened to ignite a fire in my chest, but I kept my cool, leaning against the porch post with deliberate calm, because losing my temper in front of them would only feed Karen's story, and I knew how people like her operated. Perception was everything, facts were optional, and the louder you shouted your version of reality, the more others believed it. So I let her rant, let her point at me with that clipboard like it was a weapon, let her describe in wild exaggeration how I had broken in and was attempting to illegally occupy the cabin, and her audience nodded along, some with hesitation, some with glee, all of them blind to the truth that they were pawns in her game, and while they whispered, I studied them the way I used to study enemy movements across the battlefield, noting who followed her cues, who shifted uncomfortably, who might crack under pressure once the truth was revealed. Because I knew that when the deputies finally arrived, this fragile illusion she had spun would shatter, and when it did, the fallout wouldn't just be embarrassment. It would be authority collapsing, and for someone like Karen, who thrived on the illusion of power, that collapse would sting worse than any fine or penalty. But until then, I played my role, the silent defendant in her kangaroo court, enduring her dramatic gestures as she read aloud sections of her so-called bylaw revisions, fabrications clearly written to justify her own overreach, while behind her the group murmured approval like a congregation too timid to question its preacher, and as the sun finally dipped behind the ridge, casting the clearing into dusky shadows, I heard it, the distant growl of engines, the crunch of tires on gravel, and I saw Karen stiffen with delight, snapping her fingers at her little audience as though signaling victory, her voice sharp and triumphant as she declared, "There, the deputies are here, and soon this squatter will be removed once and for all," her certainty dripping like venom. And though I stood in silence, my heart didn't race, my hands didn't shake, because, unlike the crowd that had gathered, I knew the truth of what was coming. I knew the weight of the uniforms that were about to step out of those vehicles, And I knew that the salute waiting in their hands wasn't for her, it was for me. And that knowledge settled over me like armor, unshakable as the headlights cut through the trees and the patrol cars rolled into my driveway. Section 4. The deputies arrived, the gravel crunched under the weight of county patrol vehicles as their headlights carved white beams through the shadows of the trees, and for a moment the entire gathering seemed to hold its breath, the murmurs of Karen's self-appointed jury falling silent as the engines cut off and the doors opened, spilling uniformed deputies into the dusky air with the quiet efficiency of men accustomed to authority. And there was Karen, her whole body practically vibrating, with smug anticipation straightening her blouse, fixing her hair, and waving her clipboard like a flag of triumph as she hurried toward them, her voice rising with false sweetness as she called, "Officers, thank goodness you're here. I've caught a squatter in this abandoned cabin, and he's been threatening me and the entire HOA." The words echoing across the clearing, dripping with performative panic, her tone sharp enough to make her little audience gasp as though they hadn't just watched her invent this drama out of thin air. But the deputies didn't rush to her side, didn't take her words at face value. They simply moved with professional calm, scanning the scene, their boots crunching on gravel, their hands resting near their belts, but not on their weapons, and I could see their eyes as they swept past Karen's. Theatrical gestures and landed on me, standing still on the porch with my arms crossed, back straight, gaze steady, a posture that wasn't accidental but ingrained, the stance of command, of discipline, of a man who had faced 100 harder confrontations without flinching, and in that instant recognition sparked across their faces, subtle at first, a flicker of surprise, the twitch of a brow, the kind of micro-expression only noticed by someone trained to read them, and I knew the moment. Was coming the collision between Karen's fantasy and the deputy's reality, but she was too blinded by her hunger for control to see it, too busy weaving her tale of how I had forced entry, and how she, the noble guardian of HOA order, had risked herself to protect the community, and as she spun her lies with dramatic emphasis, I stood silent, not interrupting, not arguing, because there was no need. Truth didn't need me to shout, it only needed time to surface, and as the lead deputy turned fully toward me, his eyes locking with mine, I saw the shift, the recognition deepening, the posture changing, the casual composure sharpening into respect, and before Karen could launch into her next rehearse line, the deputy snapped to attention, heels clicking together with crisp finality, his hand rising in a salute that cut through the tension like a blade, the kind of salute reserved not for a stranger, not for a trespasser, but for a commanding officer, and in that single, powerful gesture, the entire narrative shattered. The gasps that escaped the crowd behind Karen were sharp and audible, disbelief spreading across their faces as the other deputies followed suit, their hands rising in unison, saluting me with the same discipline I had once drilled into them during training, their eyes steady, voices firm as the lead deputy spoke, "Commander, sir," and the silence that followed was heavier than any thunderclap, pressing down on the clearing with the weight of truth. Revealed, and I let it hang there, savoring the moment not for my ego, but for the sheer justice of it, the vindication of watching Karen's face drain of color, her confident smirk collapsing into slack-jawed horror, her clipboard trembling in her hands as she realized she hadn't just called the deputies on a squatter, she had summoned them to confront their own commanding officer, and the humiliation that spread across her expression was almost palpable, a cocktail of fear, disbelief, and dawning regret that painted her more vividly than any words ever could. Section 5. The revelation, the silence that followed the deputy's salutes was deafening, a silence so thick it seemed to choke the life out of the clearing, and in that silence every pair of eyes shifted from Karen's trembling figure to me, waiting, wondering, realizing all at once that the story she had spun, the trespasser, the squatter, the threat to their tidy little HOA world, was nothing but a fragile lie unraveling at the seams, and when the lead deputy spoke again, his words carried not just respect but finality, the kind of finality that left no room for doubt. For the record, ma'am, this man isn't just the legal owner of this property, he's our commanding officer. And he turned back to me with a nod of deference, continuing, "Commander, your orders?" And in that single question, everything shifted. The HOA members, once smug and self-righteous in Karen's shadow, now shifting uneasily like school children caught misbehaving in front of the headmaster, there, expressions painted with shame and disbelief, while Karen herself staggered back a step as if she'd been struck, her lips parting soundlessly before she managed to choke out, "Commander? What do you mean, Commander? He's just, but the words caught in her throat, collapsing under the weight of the truth, because the deputies were no longer playing along with her fantasy. They weren't nodding at her papers or validating her ego. They were saluting me, deferring to me, exposing her for what she was, a petty tyrant whose power had always been smoke and mirrors, and as that realization spread, I could see it in the HOA crowd, the dawning recognition that they had allowed themselves to be manipulated, that they had followed a woman who wielded rules not for order but for control, and the guilt in their eyes was almost as telling as Karen's horror. It's nothing more than a failed pretender to authority, and I knew that no fine, no community service, no court appearance could wound her pride as deeply as this night already had. And so I shook my head slowly, my voice calm but resolute. "No, Deputy, the revelation is punishment enough. Let her live with it." The words landed harder than any legal charge because they weren't just mercy, they were dismissal, the final stripping away of importance, a declaration that she was no longer even worth the energy of consequence, and the deputies accepted my decision with a crisp nod, their respect unwavering, before turning their attention back to her, their tone less formal now, but firm, warning her of the legal limits she had crossed, making clear that should she repeat such actions again, she would not be so fortunate, and Karen, for all her bluster and arrogance just an hour before, nodded meekly, her voice a faint whisper of agreement, her shoulders hunched, her kingdom of rules and fines and threats reduced to ashes in the span of a single evening, and when the deputies departed, their engines growling softly into the night, the HOA members dispersed in uneasy silence, some casting me guilty glances, others not daring to look back at Karen, who remained rooted where she stood, small and broken against the vastness of the forest, and I watched her for a moment, not with triumph, but with a strange mixture of pity and satisfaction, because though she had sought to control others, to strip me of my sanctuary, to wield power she never truly had, in the end it wasn't anger or punishment that destroyed her, it was truth undeniable and absolute, delivered not with fists or fury, but with a salute, and as I finally turned back toward my cabin, stepping onto the porch that was mine by, right, the air tasted fresher, the silence richer, the homecoming complete, for I had not only reclaimed my land, but reasserted a deeper truth. That authority is not claimed through noise or arrogance, not scribbled onto clipboards or shouted in driveways, but earned through service, respect, and the quiet strength of a man who knows where he belongs. And this cabin, this land, this piece carved out of the wild, belonged to me unshakable, untouchable, mine.